and welcome to the Education Edit. This is our second episode that we are recording today, and we're joined by myself, Patty Kelly, Audrey Richardson, and Tim Brennan. So we're going to start with a little activity to get us warmed up, and then we'll do some more introductions and give some more framing for our topic today.
Yes, and I've got the warm up for us here. Okay, can you see the screen?
Yeah.
All right. So here's our quick warm up. Okay, there's 4 Jack Handey quotes. I'll read them out, and then I want the two of you to each choose your favorite one, and then because what always makes things funnier is to try to explain the funny. Okay. All right, here we go. In weightlifting, I don't think sudden, uncontrolled urination should automatically disqualify you. Second one, if you ever discover that what you're seeing is a play within a play, just slow down, take a deep breath, and hold on for the ride of your life. The third one thing kids like is to be tricked. For instance, I was going to take my little nephews to Disneyland, but instead I drove him to an old burned out warehouse. Oh no, I said, Disneyland burned down. He cried and cried, but I think deep down he thought it was a pretty good joke. I started to drive over to the real Disneyland, but it was getting pretty late. And finally, the last one, people think it would be fun to be a bird because you could fly, but they forget about the negative side, which is the preening. All right. So of those 4, which is your favorite and why?
Ooh, Tim, I love Jack Handey quotes. Give us a little context here. These are generally like for anyone who doesn't know who Jack Handey is. I mean, I'm in there. Patty, are you familiar with Jack Handey as well?
I am. It's been a while.
Mm-hmm.
But he was a SNL. It was an SNL character, correct?
Yeah.
Saturday Night Live. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's been a while. I'm having a hard time picking a favorite here. They're all pretty quirky.
So a personal one I would say I'm a little connected to, which people might not find a funny like this. I find humor in this now. As a kid, it was like, oh. But C, the one where kids like being tricked and they take a child to a burnt down Disney. We used to go out for pizza sometimes, and my dad would be like, "I'll take you out for ice cream after." But he knew that the ice cream place was closed, and then he just thought that was hysterical. And I think that's just his Irish humor coming through. But I was like, oh my God, that was, now I look back at him he just got a kick out of it. Not really sure why, but I think Jack Handey also would have.
Interesting. That seems so mean.
I know.
But yeah, kind of funny though too. For whatever reason that A is just making me laugh. Partly because I'm thinking is that real? Do they swallow? I don't know enough about weightlifting clearly, but yeah, that would be also just a bizarre activity to be a part of. Yeah. I think yeah. I clearly need to do some research on the rules of weightlifting. That's interesting.
Well, I'll ring in. I'm torn between C and D, and the thing I love about C is the premise right from the start is completely false. Just the 100% confidence in that first statement, is completely misplaced, and that just sets up the whole joke for me. And then I think, and it's a little bit drawn out too. So the two C and D are interesting comparisons, right? C is kind of drawn out, and there's a little joke every 4th word or 5th word. And then for D, you just get to the last word, and that's the joke, right? It's short, it's sweet, and then just just the word preening is a funny word on its own. And the fact that somehow that would be negative, it reveals a lot about Jack, I think. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Uh, so, uh,
So that
yes.
it's a good introduction to your humor and you in this introducing you for this activity that we're about to go into here, this information that you're going to share with us today. And so I'll introduce you, Tim. Tim was born and raised in Astoria, New York, then headed north to Syracuse to earn a BS in electrical engineering. While in Boston as an engineer, completed a nighttime master's in digital signal processing at Northeastern. Interesting. I'm going to have to learn about what that really means. That's fascinating. Left Boston in 1992 to do a one-year teacher training program with UVM, then settled into a long career at Woodstock Union High School as a science teacher. Was the runner-up Vermont Teacher of the Year in 2003, the Vermont Academy of Science and Engineering Teacher of the Year in 2005, and has presented on behalf of NASA's GLAST Ambassador, or GLAST. It looks like that's an acronym, Ambassador Program, and as a Next Generation Science Exemplar Facilitator. So welcome, Tim.
Thank you, Patty. Let me go to my first slide here, right? This is our topic today is Deep Learning 101. One thing I would just add to this is I'm now recently retired from the Mountain Views Union, Supervisory Union, and happily enjoying my retirement and loving being able to connect with the two of you to do this kind of work here.
So great, Tim. Tim, the
Yeah.
Jack Handy part, I think is like, it's such a great opener. You referenced that you use that in professional learning opportunities. And I can remember one particular where we were doing a deep learning, essentially summer camp. And, I know we were talking about starting off like without telling folks that these were not supposed to be serious quotes. And we really, do you remember this? Like we go around
Yes,
in
I
a
do.
circle and people are reading these quotes and not expecting them to be ridiculous, but just expecting them to be like actual. And, they are so ridiculous. And as people are reading them out, they're looking around like, what's going on? And I absolutely don't want to steal your thunder right now because you have so much to say on deeper learning. But I think I was like, what was our purpose for doing that? Like, did we just want to make them laugh? Maybe. But I remember specifically talking about like this sort of providing this unexpected piece where they really had to like critically think like what exactly am I doing right now? I'm in this educational space, but I'm like picking up on something. I don't know if that's what you were thinking too, but or if you remember differently.
I do remember the piece that I remember most is that was really an outcome of the fact that we were mutually planning on a Google Doc, and somehow a Jack Handy reference got into our planning, and that was a good 45-minute rabbit hole where we each were.
Individually
Yes,
went
yes,
in
yes,
and
yes,
couldn't, and then we
yeah.
ended up I think texting each other later like I've been cry laughing for because if you really get into those, they're like they're limitless and they're pretty darn funny. And I think, okay, I'm gonna talk about Tim for just a second before I get started. Like I think this really speaks, like Patty said, to Tim's humor and the way in which Tim you interact with people, and the way I think that tone and things like that are so important in professional learning spaces. And I feel like here we're trying to accomplish some of that as well. While we have, the information that we want to share with folks, it's really about like, how can we be more human and keep the tone light sometimes. And I think that's been some of the most enjoyable times for me have been doing with professional learning with you, Tim, or Patty, who has quite a sense of humor as well. And just keeping it feeling really human and like being allowed to laugh, whether it's about assessment or whether it's about deeper learning. So that's my glowing review of
Yeah.
Tim's vibe
Well,
when doing
thank
PD.
thank you,
So go
Audrey.
on.
Thank you, thank you. Uh, well, let's jump in here. I'm going to I know I've been introduced. I'll just share one more little slide of introduction here. Yeah, this is another way to sort of get to know me. I suppose on the left side, there's a picture of myself at the Baseball Hall of Fame, standing next to a statue of Buck O'Neill, who was a longtime Kansas City Monarch baseball player in the days before Jackie Robinson integrated baseball. And I'm also proudly wearing my Kansas City Monarchs t-shirt. And I think even as a statue, Buck had greater mobility than I do at this point. So yeah, he's kind of a hero. I have interests in baseball and pop music and SCTV and longtime interests in figuring out approaches in the classroom that really enhance the teaching and learning cycle. So that's me. Okay, so today's goals, I'm hoping to spend some time just looking a little bit at like sort of a history and a definition of deep learning, and then really spending time figuring out how you could incorporate deep learning ideas into your curriculum, your instruction, your assessment. And one of the ways in which we'll do that is by looking at deep learning opportunities at a variety of grain sizes, large, long-term projects, down to much simpler instructional choices that teachers might make. And asking the question, is it even possible to do deep learning in the form of an exit ticket? And I hope to show some real examples of deep learning in classrooms. Okay. All right, let's get underway. So I think this phrase deep learning is a relatively new phrase, but I think the desire for deepness in the classroom has always been with us. So I want to explore that a little bit. And being a good Vermonter, I have to start with John Dewey, born in 1859, and real belief that education was a mean for really creating informed citizens and supporting democracy, which seems pretty prescient at this moment in time. There are a few quotes there. I'll read them out for those of you who can't see the slides. Education is not preparation for life. Education is life itself. We do not learn from experience. We learn from reflecting on experience. And the self is not something ready-made, but something in continuous formation through choice of action. And what I get out of this is that he may have been one of the early proponents of the idea that, going to school or learning is not just filling up a vessel, right? Not just like giving information, but rather making sure that there's some experiential part to it, some reflection to it, and some real transformation that happens. And I think we're going to connect this to deep learning in just a moment. More recently, there's been this idea of understanding by design, creating unit plans that focus on the idea of transfer and big ideas. And there are some elements here that I think are really important. But one thing that I remember from my work in UBD was the sort of 20-20-20 credo, right? Oftentimes we're asking our students, to know something for the next 20 days, like what do they need to do to be successful on the quiz, right? Or we might be teaching for learning outcomes that'll sustain over say 20 weeks. If I'm in algebra, how do I prepare my students for geometry, next semester or next year, right? But I think Wiggins and McTighe said there has to be a third 20, right? There has to be an even more important 20, which is what do I want students to know 20 years from now? Who do I want them to be? What kind of big ideas do I want them to kind of carry around with them for their lives? And I think that that's sort of a form of deep learning. And we'll see how the ideas of transfer and so forth will work into other current definitions of deep learning. Susan Brookhart wrote a book in 2010 entitled How to Assess Higher Order Thinking Skills, or HOTS. And an important quote from her from that book, in life, almost everything we do requires using knowledge in some way, not just knowing it. And of course, that's even more important in 2010 and beyond, right? With the explosion of the internet and the ability for anybody really to find out a fact in a matter of moments, but being able to do something with that fact, or being able to contextualize that or make some meaning out of it, is another story entirely. So I got deep into this idea of higher order thinking skills back at that time, because I really believed that quote about not just having some bit of information, but being able to do something with it. So that's where maybe my personal journey for deep learning began. And then more recently, certainly in Vermont and many places around the country, we've moved to a proficiency-based assessment or scoring system. And one of the things that I think many educators believe is that the distinction between proficient and distinguished is an important one, and that a 4, if you will, or distinguished work is not just a well done proficient work, not just, I don't know, that it's neat, or it's just more of the same. That a 4 score, if you will, must be something that represents a different kind of thinking, another mode of thinking, or another way of showing your real deep understanding. So those are all like in the background, right? Things that have been happening for a while, and influencing educators for at least in Dewey's case, the last 100 years, right? But what does the research say about deep learning? And we'll just jump in here with a couple of different texts. Okay, the National Research Council has a lot to say about this, but if we look at the bold type here, it says that deep learning is really the learning for transfer, that students develop expertise in a particular discipline or subject area, and they develop 21st century competencies, transferable knowledge and skills in the cognitive, interpersonal, and intrapersonal domains. So in summary, the NRC likes the idea of transfer and adds in thoughts about intrapersonal skills. For me, that was really kind of interesting, because another piece that's influencing our instruction these days is the idea of social emotional learning and creating trauma-informed practices in our classroom. And I like when initiatives kind of line up as opposed to being at odds with one another. So thinking about, as the NRC says, some inter and intrapersonal domains, I think really opens up the classroom to social emotional learning as a component of deep learning. Then there's a book by Fullen and Quinn and McEachin called Deep Learning, Engage the World, Change the World. And again, they, if we just focus in on the bold-faced type here on the page, on the slide, deep learning is about developing character, citizenship, collaboration, communication, creativity, and critical thinking. So I'm counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 C's, right? Character, citizenship, collaboration, communication, creativity, and critical thinking. So they are reiterating the interpersonal skills and the idea of doing something, as we saw uh, being promoted by Susan Brookhart in her HOTS book. So all these strands are kind of overlapping one another, and I think mutually reinforcing one another. And again, I find that to be compelling, right? It's not just a single person saying something, but this message coming from a wide variety of sources. And finally, a little bit more on the research, right? The Hewlett Foundation in 2013 said that deeper learning is those combined characteristics of schooling that enable learners to, quote, develop significant understanding of core academic content, exhibit critical thinking and problem-solving skills, collaborate, communicate, direct their own learning, and possess an academic mindset. So Hewlett adds in, amongst other things, right, self-direction as a form of intrapersonal learning. And there we hear and see echoes of Dewey's idea of reflection upon experience. So what has happened in many places around the country is that school districts have taken big ideas like this and created something that might be known as a profile or a portrait of a graduate. And these are aspirational desires of a district as they figure out, okay, if maybe they're not using the phrase deep learning, but they're saying if we want this long-term impact of our education on our students, we need to identify who we want them to be at the end of their time with us. And so they've created these portraits of a graduate and said that, essentially all the work that we're doing is leading towards this. And I have an example of one from our mutual home district. The formerly known Windsor Central Supervisory Union put together a form of a profile of the graduate. And this is a little bit of an abridged version of it. There are 4 of 5 components are shown here on the slide: self-direction and stewardship, critical thinking and problem solving, and skillful communication. And many of those point directly to the things that the research has been saying. And if you look more carefully at the individual indicators underneath each of those categories, you'll see a lot of what we've just been talking about, coming up again and again and again. Dewey's idea of citizenship gets mirrored in the category that we call stewardship, right? And you see critical thinking and problem solving, you see self-direction and so forth. All those things are in there. So that's one example of where one district landed, and I bet many of our listeners probably have something very similar happening in their districts. So let me pause for a second, because I think we're about to take off in a different direction, but that's kind of for me anyway, a summary of kind of like, where deep learning has been over the past century, and what it might look like, or how it gets defined today. Any quick thoughts?
Tim, I kind of I'm just curious, like for you, with the idea, like the merging idea of deeper learning and portrait of a graduate, like how did that come about for you? Where did you kind of gain that insight
Yeah,
to make that
thanks.
connection?
Thanks. They were proceeding, like my understanding of deep learning and the district's development of the portrait of the graduate were proceeding kind of on parallel tracks. And it was a little bit of sort of happenstance for me anyway, that by the time our portrait of the graduate was completed, I kept seeing all those elements of the portrait of the graduate reflected in the research on deep learning. And so as a way to sort of well, do two things to help define deep learning for people in my own district, but also to promote the Portrait of the Graduate as being a valid document of something that has real impact in classrooms or could have real impact in classrooms. I started to make the connection, I think, with others. I mean, you included, I'm sure, conversations that, led to this idea that, oh, wait, um, uh, uh, when we say we want you to be, engaging in practices that lead to deeper learning, what we're saying is that we want you to be able to support the Portrait of the Graduate. We want you to be able to include this somehow in your planning and unit planning and lesson planning and so forth.
Right.
So
So
it's a
it's
little bit
not
of
some
like,
new thing. It's more, it's actually does like, both things are in concert with one another, and really they're,
yes, and we all had sort of hung up the Portrait of the Graduate in our classrooms, but you
mhm,
can hang up things in the classroom and then they just become part of the background, right?
mhm.
Or it could become something that really has some driving force to it. And I think I was sort of interested in, the value of, oh, this piece of paper is my like guideline towards doing instruction that could lead to deep learning. And for me, anyway, the deep learning piece felt really important. And so, why reinvent the wheel? I have this thing that my district wants me to be doing anyway.
Yeah, like these aren't just like a set of norms that are like, oh, know this. And I mean, this is really deeply ingrained in how, our we develop our perspectives, we develop and our students really understand the world around them. And it does, being able to have that connection really does make it more, um, I don't know, more connected in that way.
Yeah, well, it's kind of a rare case where kind of uh, what would you call it? Kind of this kind of pie in the sky document has some real like uh, on the ground kind of impact. Has some real authenticity. Oftentimes something like this could be created and it's just really divorced from the reality of the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like this was a nice instance where, if you think about your planning in a certain way, this could be a critical tool.
Mm,
Oh,
absolutely.
yeah. All right. Well, let's move on here. Uh, so here's the big question, right? If I believe that engaging students in deeper learning is valuable, how do I make that happen? What do deeper learning classrooms look like, and so on. So we'll spend a little bit of time here thinking about, okay, so if you're in, how do you make it happen? Okay. Um, one answer to this is to pick up a copy of the book In Search of Deeper Learning by Jal Mehta and Sarah Fine. They had essentially the same question: what does deeper learning look like in the classroom? And they kind of did a long-term study. Well, a couple of years they went around observing lots of schools and making all kinds of observations, and then kind of sifting through everything. And what they decided was where they saw deeper learning happening, they saw these three bullet items here. They saw deeper learning happening at the intersection of three critical what atmospheric ideas, or three critical aspects of the classroom. That there would be time for mastery, there'd be some sense of identity, and there'd be some opportunity for creativity. And then a really important idea that emerged from this book for me was that these when these things are happening on a regular basis, mastery, identity, creativity, they're happening inside of like classroom experiences that take, say, an hour, right? So I've got an hour with my students of biology today, and then again tomorrow, and so forth. I've got these 1 hour windows where I can create these particular learning experiences. And if I if I'm able to like mix in mastery, identity, and creativity, a little bit in each hour, right, then deeper learning happens over a long period of time. Let's say at a secondary school from 7th through 12th grade, right? Um, uh, Deeper learning is not happening in a moment or in a single class or in a single lesson, right? But it's this idea of, kind of lots of opportunities to engage in the aspects of deeper learning that will lead to deeper learning over a long period of time. Anyway, maybe this will become more evident in a moment here. Here's the Venn diagram, right, of a circle of mastery and identity and creativity. And they define those things in some particular ways. We're going to look at that in a moment. But at that intersection is where these powerful learning experiences will occur. So here's a quick definition of their idea of mastery. And I want to show each of these and then show how their definition of mastery, identity, and creativity harken back to the research or harken back to Dewey or harken back to all the precursors that we've been talking about here. So they say, quote, mastery is dimensions of deeper learning that are tied to substantive knowledge of content, transfer of this knowledge, pattern recognition and expertise, and understanding the structure of a field or a discipline. All right, so that's their definition. And we can see these connections here, right? The substantive content of knowledge, right? This is a component of academic excellence that Dewey was promoting, that the NRC has brought out, and that Hewlett mentioned. And by the way, was the missing fifth element of the Mountain View's profile of a graduate. The fifth topic was academic excellence. Transfer of knowledge, mentioned by Mehta and Fine, right, is of course a key goal of Wiggins and McTighe's understanding by design. And then finally, understanding the structure of a discipline is something that's really echoed by the NRC and by the Common Core curriculum and the next generation science standards, to name just a couple of those kind of nationwide initiatives. Mehta and Fine often refer to deep learning in any given discipline as like doing the whole job, but on a smaller scale. So mimicking what it means to be a scientist, or mimicking what it means to be a journalist, or mimicking what it means to be a mathematician, and sort of doing those kinds of jobs on a small scale in the classroom. All right, let's take a look at identity. All right, here they define this as the way in which deeper learning is driven by intrinsic motivation, the way it is fueled by learners' perceptions of the relevance of the content, and the way in which learning becomes deeper as it becomes a core part of the self. So what does that connect to? So the intrinsic motivation is this form of self-direction mentioned by Hewlett and NRC and Fullen, and the relevance of the content was brought up by Dewey and by Wiggins McTighe in the understanding by design idea. Okay, how do you see yourself as being, part of this particular discipline? And then their last element, right, is the element of creativity, the shift from receiving the accumulated knowledge of a subject to being able to act or make something within that field. Taking this step builds on one's understanding of a domain and incorporates it into a creative act. So that shift, right, from receiving to acting or making something is something that Dewey and Brookhart would support, and it parallels the shift from consuming to producing in the digital realm and elsewhere. As we've introduced computers and phones and smartphones and so forth into our classroom, iPads and tablets of all sort, we're really struggling with like what students do, or even what we do as adults with that technology. Are we just endless consumers, or are we using this as a tool to wind up being, producers, creators, right? We'd love to see that shift, right, to more production and more creativity as opposed to just endless and sometimes mindless consumption, right? Okay, so we've made a graphic organizer, and I say we very loosely because what I'm about to show you is really the product of Audrey's artwork from a few years ago. Long conversations about like what it means to be to plan for deep learning, right? If you're a classroom teacher, how do you go about and think in this way to kind of create deep learning opportunities? So we call it the layer cake approach, and want you to see this next image here. And for people who are just listening, I'll try to describe it. Okay. So again, this is Audrey's product here. At the top, there are a couple of boxes, and the boxes, one box says standards, and one says skills. And there's a little arrow that says start here. And of course, if you're a classroom teacher, you're often starting with those standards and those skills as you try to figure out what your lesson plans are going to be. What are you going to bring in on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday for students to be doing? What do you want them to be thinking about? What kind of information do they need? What kind of information do you want to withhold from them so that they can explore whatever that is? You need to figure out, right, what your academic standards are and what those skills are. Okay, and that's the what of it, right? Like what are you learning, if in a sense? And then it's a little harder to read, but on the side of the standards and skills boxes, on the side of the standards box, it says no, K-N-O-W, and on the side of the skills box, it says do, and then that gets us part way there, right? We've got the standards and skills that we always use to like plan our lessons. Then here's where we begin to do some deep learning, right? Then we're going to add in another box, and in this case, we'll just refer to it as the POG, the Portrait of the Graduate. And those are those long-term kind of those modes of being that we want our students to enter into. And so the POG box is, who do we want our students to be? And that's the why of what we're learning, right? We've got what we're learning and why we're learning it. And then finally, the final box is a little bit more like a funnel, right? All those things are fed through some kind of instructional lens, right? As a teacher, what kind of action do I want my students to be taking? Is this a reading exercise? Is this a role play? Is this a note taking exercise? What is the instructional lens that I want to use to get my students to engage with this information? Okay, and if we're able to do that, it's our contention that you'd have students. You'd be figuring out what you want them to know, what that you want them to do, and who you want them to be, and that would all lead to some sense of deeper learning, not just on Monday, but throughout the whole year and throughout their whole time in school. So, know, do, and be, which probably sounds pretty familiar to a lot of our elementary school teachers, because I think that's kind of a mantra that they use for planning their time with their students. Let's see. Maybe we'll stop there for a moment because we're going to look at examples in a second, but I just want to pause and see if there's maybe from Audrey or Patty any comments or thoughts or questions.
Well, Tim, I feel like you're being very generous. So this is one of those images that is definitely the brainchild of, how do we make this visible to people? So folks, who are listening, if you check out the slideshow after to see that it like in my brain, the way you would talk about it and explain it to me, I'm like, oh, this kind of reminds me of like a little bit of like a factory almost, but not like the complete opposite of a factory in ways, right? Like it's not like we're trying to think of industrialized learning, but like this idea of like, oh, there can be a method to this. And sometimes I certainly need to rely on systems to help me plan or to help me think through it. And so I think that in thinking through this diagram, it was like, oh, like what if there was a little bit of a flow to this that doesn't always have to go in this order, but really can kind of help us see the relationship between something like a portrait of a graduate, with not all schools or districts have, but we have Vermont transferable skills. And I think that really, that connector, how do you not reinvent the wheel and say, oh, deeper learning is this new other thing, right? It's really about like, no, these are all working together in concert. And then how do we visualize the process in which we might be able to internalize thinking more through that lens?
Yeah, yeah. It's a nice graphic organizer for like those first 5 or 10 lesson plans that you might
Right.
be doing as you start to think about like, oh, well, how can I bring deep learning opportunities into my classroom? And I bet that within a very short amount of time, it just becomes something internalized, and those kinds of choices get made almost unconsciously because you just think of your classroom in a somewhat different way.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I just love that connection. The way that layer of the portrait of graduate is brought in just gives me a really different perspective for that planning aspect, that classroom planning piece. Um, I like that connection because I like you know, when you talk about the portrait of a graduate or like district system level goal setting and strategic plans being like on the wall, but that really thoughtful connection making is so important. And that earlier when you talked about the thinking about what we want students, who we want students to be 20 years later, you know, and that's really at the heart of the portrait of a graduate, right? Is like, it's
Yes.
not what we want them to do, it's who they want to be. And making that specific connection with what is happening in our classroom to help facilitate that. I love the way
Mhm.
that this.
Yeah.
It
Thanks.
reminds me, Patty, of, you cut out a little bit at the end there, but it reminds me of when people say, they talk about school and then they say, but in the real world, right? Like, what if we could incorporate more of that experience, and not just through project-based learning, but also through, and I know Tim, you're probably chat about this, and you have already mentioned the idea of like through exit tickets, like how do we make a connection to critical thinking, to, you know, creativity, to just, you know, like social justice, equity, like all of these things that really, we don't want school to be a separate like vacuum world, right? We
Right.
really, our students, especially as they get older, you know, but really laying the groundwork starting in pre-K, right? You know, we've certainly done some professional learning, and had some experiences with pre-K teachers who are incorporating deeper learning beautifully into their, and were such great assets to a larger district team because they really like just could think in that way. So I think a huge part of the benefit of the portrait of a graduate and the idea of deeper learning is the idea that it is bringing, not just bringing the real world to students, but rather allowing students to understand that they are in the real world, and these are the skills that will help them navigate not only
Mhm.
school but also life beyond.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Thanks. All right. I'll move ahead here. Um, so I want to provide some examples of deeper learning outcomes from my practice and the practice of my peers who've been generous enough to share thoughts with me. And I first will look at a couple of project-based learning um, uh, 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 initiatives from the past few years, because I think that's where people often go when they think about deep learning is like, oh, it should be project-based learning. And um, it's my contention that the, there is some overlap there. You could do project-based learning. That is, in fact, deep learning. And when it's at its best, it is that. But I also think that there are examples of like, you know, some projects that may not truly get to the deeper learning aspect of it. They may be more, they may be hands-on in some ways, but they may not be minds-on in some really important ways. And I think that would preclude them from being deeper learning examples. Well, let's take a look at a couple, and then we'll look at some smaller grain-sized efforts at deep learning. Oh, yes. So first of all, here's an image that is very well known and is from a fantastic organization called the Buck Institute. And they have really, really figured out like project-based learning in its you know, its most effective state, right? I know personally that when I see something like this and I see 7 different facets of something that I have to be able to pull off, I can get a little bit, I can feel daunted pretty easily. And I can almost immediately walk away from project-based learning because it's too big of a lift. And I know that people who do it and do it well understand that it's not necessarily that much of a lift, but it can feel that way. And so 4 or 5 years ago, maybe more like 6 years ago, I went to a workshop with some colleagues, and we decided that we were going to try to help remove some of the barriers to project-based learning. We're going to try to help teachers embrace project-based learning. And what we came up with was something that we called the bronze standard. We decided that we were focused on the bottom half of this wheel, and that if you as a teacher, wait, let me back up a second. What we realized was that a lot of our colleagues were already doing of these 3 circles here: student voice and choice, critique, revise, and reflection, and public product. Those are the 3 circles. That a lot of our colleagues were doing one or more of those things pretty frequently in their classrooms, and they were really, really close to doing something that, if not the gold standard, would be really super powerful and would lead to, we weren't using the language of deep learning at that time, but really lead to great outcomes. So we thought, oh, if we get people to focus on these things, most of which have some buy-in already with our colleagues, we might be able to like open the door to a lot more project-based learning. So the three aspects that we started to promote with our colleagues were featuring assignments that had student voice and choice in them, having assignments where there was at least one moment where a product was critically reviewed and a chance for revision based on reflection, and then knowing that the final product was going to be shared publicly, like knowing that right from the start, and be able to kind of create some kind of public space for the finished work. So that's what we promoted. And here's a couple of examples of the sort of bronze standard at work, at least at Woodstock Union High School in the last several years. Astronomy students were given multiple projects to work on over the course of a year. And you can see here, a couple of students are kind of presenting, or if you're just listening, there are a couple of students presenting kind of a cardboard mock-up of some kind of a sun seeker apparatus, like one could imagine this as a sophisticated version of a sundial and so forth, but some way in which they could use the sun to kind of like, tell time during the day or during the year and so on. So they're kind of presenting this mock-up, and they were going to get feedback from their colleagues, from their peers, and then act on that feedback. And we'd have these final products displayed in the library when it was all said and done. So that was a nice example of like subjecting their work to critique and revision. Um, from the same class, but a different project, comes this slide. Okay, it's a little bit of a busy slide, so let me kind of I guess I'll sort of read through it. Okay, on the left hand side in the red box are the actual notes taken by a recorder when some students presented their project on astrochemistry. The choice was astro blank. So they could do astrophysics, astrochemistry, archaeoastronomy, like any way of taking astronomy and blending it with some other science discipline. Okay. These students wanted to create a game where you could understand how elements of the periodic table were formed inside the core of stars. So on the left-hand side, there are notes taken by a recorder when they made their presentation. This is a great idea of interactive learning. It's creative. It clearly states the objective of the game. All kinds of like feedback to the students about what they had done. Okay, so students shared their design goals and the initial efforts towards their project. Volunteers took notes on the feedback that the group provided, and then the presenters, and this is critical, they went back to their document and they added in their responses. They would either apply or deny the feedback based on their initial project goals. I think this is really huge. When you open yourself up to critique and somebody says, I don't like that color, or I think you should change the font or whatever, you have to be able to, as the designer, still make design decisions and decide if that critique is something you want to like take in because it helps you meet your goals, or if you think that maybe the person who was, providing the feedback didn't quite get what your project goals were. And so you could, in good conscience, like deny that recommendation, right? So let me show you on the next slide here what these students did. They had this feedback, and then here's what they did and as a response. So on the left-hand side here was the suggestion, okay? Clearly state the objective of the game, think about responses versus directive game structure, make the game more sustainable, and prototype rules. And then on the right-hand side of the table are their responses. And in blue, you can see where the students articulate whether they accepted the suggestion or not. So, the suggestion was to clearly state the objective of the game. And they said, we accept this suggestion because it fits with the learning goals of both making the game fun and creating an educational goal for the players. Responses versus directive game structure. Okay, they said, while we understand the idea to base your planet off of the elements you're obtaining, it may be desirable. We would rather continue with our idea to pick your planet in the beginning and base the elements on that. And I'll go down. We want to stick with the idea of having an original identity. So some of this is lost because we're not really seeing the project itself, but you can see the idea that students have to consider each critique and decide if they're going to fold it in or let go of it, that it won't work for them. So that was I think, right, a lot of high-level thinking about their product, about their, how it's going to change over time, and what makes the project really work for other people. Right, here's an example in an English classroom, and there are a series of photographs here. But again, this gets to the idea of the public product and the opening yourself up to critique. And so I think this is an English, ninth grade English classroom from a few years ago. And each intern, each of the various groups are standing in front of the class with some kind of poster, preliminary poster put together outlining their thinking. And then at the bottom of the slide, there's sort of like final products. One's a little diorama, and one's more of a kind of looks like an architectural set of drawings with some design statement in the center here and so forth. So, public product and a lot of critique and reflection. Okay. I've just got one or two more, and then maybe we'll pause for a second. And I might ask Audrey to weigh in on this one as well. This was, I think, from our colleague Julie Brown, The Work of Centuries, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
This was
from a structured literacy class.
yeah, which is
Yeah.
really cool. I can speak more generally to it. So Julie had a number of you know endeavors in the deeper learning sphere, which is really cool because Julie primarily was teaching structured literacy, and this is a group of students who are in some ways learning still to read fluently, and needing more explicit instruction in literacy, and it I just think this speaks to the conversation that's going on right now around literacy in not just our state but around the country, and the idea that yes, like a student may struggle with literacy and need to be explicitly taught even later in their educational career, but that does not take the place of deeper learning and relationship to content and relationship to experience, and really having a hands-on, not just hands-on, but just a critical thinking experience. And we know that's essential in the English classroom, the ELA classroom, really any classroom, right? So this is just an example. These are some images of Julie students out and about, and really just kind of not able to kind of tackle, and I can't actually remember what the end product was, but I know she's done connections with veterans, and I believe they were working on a trail system here, where there's a connection to writing and reading, but also getting out and making sure that connection is actually authentic.
Yeah. I think they wound up doing a lot of interviews with people and kind of like gleaning their expertise in this case, or the interviews with like in another case, a local senior citizen center to get a sense of like Vermont over the course of the last century and so forth. So there's a lot of interaction and careful listening and recording, sort of using these individuals almost as case studies of what it means to be a Vermonter. And I think, as you were saying, right, this is an idea of like deep learning for all students, not just for the students taking AP classes or whatever, but for students who may have some learning challenges. Every student has the sort of the right to be exposed to deep learning opportunities.
Absolutely.
And there are ways of crafting it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Linda, as you and I both know, Linda Darling Hammond has a lot out there on deeper learning or equitable access to deeper learning. And I think that pretty much as soon as deeper learning has sort of emerged into many of our pedagogies, it also begs the question, like, who is deeper learning for, right? Like, and the answer is everyone. And it is an essential kind of avenue in education that sometimes gets overshadowed by the technicalities and the things we think we're supposed to be doing, but really is something that can deeply connect us again with the portrait of the graduate and those sort of those skills that we want folks going out into the world with.
Great. Thanks. Okay, let's shift now to like, what about some smaller choices you can make? If project-based learning can be one way in which we get to deeper learning. But if we're going to be faithful to the idea of like Meta and Fine saying, hey, deep learning is something that happens, that's an accumulating thing that's happening over a long period of time, we're not always doing project-based learning, right? We need to be able to be doing deep learning, or providing deep learning opportunities with simple everyday classroom maneuvers. Okay, so I would like to explore a little bit here of well, one of my favorite things to think about is like how small something can get before it loses its real essence. And one of my favorite quotes of all time comes from the Village Voice music editor Robert Christgau. He was reviewing the third Ramones album, and at that point, the Ramones were starting to add in like a guitar solo, or they were adding in, a little bit of extra instrumentation. They were adding in, just little elements, right? And he described the third album as this. He said, having explored how much you can take out of music and still have rock and roll, the Ramones are now exploring how much you can put back in and still be the Ramones. And I just thought that was really a great quote, and at least the first part applies here. How small can we get and still do deep learning? So that's where I am. Yeah. Brought to you by Robert Christgau. All right, so let's explore the idea of an exit ticket. If we're going to do this, let's go really small. I've admitted publicly, and I'll admit right now, that sometimes an exit ticket for me is not really, or hasn't really been, about education. It's been about figuring out what I'm going to do with those final 4 minutes of class because the lesson went a little bit short. And so I will just make up an exit ticket, right? And have students fill something out on a piece of paper that, probably has some real meaning, but I have to admit, it was not particularly thoughtful on my part. But what if I was thoughtful? What if I was trying to design an exit ticket that I think would contribute to the Meta and Fine idea of consistent opportunities that create a long-term deep learning? So I explored this, and I made up a little exercise for myself. And here's one of like 6 different exit tickets I made one day as I thought about this idea. So I took stewardship as my portrait of the graduate element that I think would create deep learning. Okay, and so here's what I came up with. I thought, all right, let's say that this was a health and wellness class, and that the goal of the lesson was to enhance the ideas of community health and wellness. Okay, that was part of the lesson. And at the end of the class, I had thoughtfully planned to ask this little 3-2-1 exit ticket. So in the final 5 minutes, students have an index card, and they're supposed to state 3 ideas that we're wrestling with. So like, what is it we've been talking about? And what are the trade-offs about community health and wellness? What are the advantages of, providing, say, individual freedoms versus community health and well-being, right? So what are 3 ideas we're wrestling with? And briefly describe 2 ideas that represents the class's consensus. So, have you been listening to what's going on? Can you state where you think we are at the end of this class in terms of any kind of consensus? And then here's a piece that I think brings us into the realm of stewardship. Can you acknowledge one person for their contributions to our understanding? And what I mean by that is one person in the classroom. So can you say, hey, Patty Kelly made these great observations in class and really made me think about this in a different way. And how is that stewardship? If stewardship is about like taking care of your environment, right? I want to promote the idea that like the classroom is an environment that we all have a role in sustaining and creating. And so if I can get people to be stewards of the classroom by recognizing how each of us makes contributions to what's going on in class, I'm helping to create a sense of stewardship. So I don't know if you're buying that, but I like the idea of it's an exit ticket and it's an earnest effort, I think, to sort of create a sense of community, a sense of stewardship in the classroom, and a little bit of what would we call like interpersonal skills, right? Recognizing that other people have made some real great contributions. So that's one. Okay. Smallest possible choice you could make, an exit ticket. And I think it has some elements of deep learning to it. Um, there's one other example, not an exit ticket, but sort of a formative assessment. Maybe this is a 15-minute exercise in class. Okay, I taught chemistry for some years, and here at the top of this slide, I'll try to describe this for our listeners. There's a list, right? It says we're going to do chemistry. The content standard is intermolecular forces. The anchor standard, the skill that we're trying to develop, is explaining, and that means explaining using evidence and reasoning, right? And the part of the portrait of the graduate that I'm trying to promote is critical thinking and problem solving. And to the right is a picture of what looks like a lake taken from, an atmospheric camera, so from a plane. But it's actually, yes, a picture of a lake, but it's taken from a probe that was sent to Saturn and went exploring one of Saturn's largest moon, in fact, the largest moon in the solar system, called Titan. And the pictures we got from Titan show lakes of methane. So the dark image in the photograph here is a gigantic lake of methane, which of course is just a gas on Earth. But on Titan, it exists as a liquid and a gas. And so here's the prompt for the formative assessment. On Titan, Saturn's largest moon, methane exists as a liquid and a gas and undergoes a cycle of evaporation and condensation, much as water does on Earth. Use evidence and reasoning to predict a range of temperatures that must exist at or near the surface of Titan based on this image, based on this information. So now students have to think about, wait, what does it mean for something to exist in more than one state? What must be the range of temperatures that allow that to happen? And what do I need to know about methane compared to, say, water that will help me make this prediction? So I think there's a lot going on there, and it's not a giant task, right? But kind of a formative assessment where you can see, what kind of thinking are students bringing to the fore here. So a couple of quick examples. I think that's it for just showing some classroom examples on a small scale. So I've kind of lost track of time a little bit. I want to make sure we're not overrunning at this point, and just want to send it back to my facilitator to get a little bit of feedback there.
I think tell us a little bit about what might remain, Tim, as far as what you'd like to talk with us about.
So what might remain here is that there's this game that we've developed where people are kind of put into a place of designing an impromptu lesson based on some random dice rolls. So there's I think we could describe the game and show how it's played, or not actually play it, but just kind of walk through it a little bit. And then if folks wanted to take that back into their districts to, play around with that and have a little bit of, playtime with the idea of deeper learning, they would have a better sense of what to do. So that's, I think, what remains.
I think that sounds great. I mean, it's so great to see these different size examples of deeper learning and sort of the operating of the portrait of a graduate. But also to see like what does this look like in a professional learning context, and can that actually be fun? I think the answer is yes. So yeah, let's hear it.
Okay.
Let's learn about this game.
Okay. So we're going to play the deeper learning game. Okay. I'm going to give you a brief description of the game, and it's critical when you do this in your homeschool that you'll go off in groups for just 10 minutes. It is important that the design time be limited, right? It is not 10 days, it is not 10 weeks, it is 10 minutes, right? Go off, do something fast, and come back with something that will be worth discussing. Okay, so that's an important piece. Okay, so here's how the game gets played. All right, you're going to get some dice. In fact, I think we're going to provide a link to a dice roller. So if you wanted to let me go to that. Here we go. This is a virtual dice roller. Okay. Where you can set the number of dice to 4, you can set the number of sides to 6, and so you could come up with a little set of numbers that will help you play the game. Okay, so you're going to get some dice, and you're going to translate the 4 rolls by using a game board, and those 4 dice are going to tell you what your design task is. Then you go off for 10 minutes, do your thing, and come back and have a rich conversation. Okay. So here's the game board. It's 4 quadrants. In the upper left quadrant, it says content. And in the upper right quadrant, it says skill. In the lower left quadrant, it says POG disposition. And in the lower right quadrant, it says lens. And those match the 4 boxes from our layer cake drawing, right? Standard, content standards, skills, portrait of the graduate, and the instructional lens. Those are 4 choices you might make in your, planning time. Okay, and then in each box, there are 3 different outcomes. Okay, we really could get away with a 3-sided die, but they're hard to come by, and so 6-sided die are much easier to find. But say this game board, the content, if you roll a 1 or a 2, you'd be in the ELA or social studies area. If you roll a 3 or 4, you'd be in math or science. You roll a 5 or 6, you'd be in health and wellness, and so on. Okay, and each quadrant has 3 different tasks that can give you a wide variety of combinations depending upon what you rolled. So you use the board to translate from the dice rolls into your specific design task. So here's an example. If you rolled a 5, 1, 1, 6, okay, then you go to your board, right? I guess I'll jump back and forth here. A 5 puts you in the health and wellness area, okay, for the content. A 1, we're going to go back to our skills here. A 1 means find or use a pattern. So that's a skill that you'd be developing in the health and wellness area, right? Another 1 would say that the portrait of the graduate element would be stewardship. And then the final roll was a 6. And you're saying, oh, okay, the instructional choice I'm making here is an exit ticket. So I'm going to pretend I'm a health and wellness teacher. I've got a lesson that's going to fold in finding and using a pattern, embracing stewardship, and the way in which I'm going to be asking my students to do this is by designing an exit ticket for them to engage in. So that would be the task. You go off with 2 or 3 colleagues, take 10 minutes, wrestle with this. You've got lots of choices inside of health and wellness, right, for specific content areas. But those would be your defining features of the lesson, if you will. Okay, so that's the way the game gets played. And let me see, is there anything else? No, I think that is it for the game. All right, and if you do this with like 20 or 30 people on your staff, you're going to wind up with 6 or 7 different groups, and I think you're going to come back with some really interesting conversations.
Yeah, it's been really fun to see this game be played. And, sometimes it causes a little bit of initial stress, like, oh, well, this isn't how I lesson plan. I need a lot of, and for most, though, I think it's kind of an invited experience of just kind of getting to brainstorm and really introduce some fresh thinking. It's kind of like the whose line of is it anyways of lesson planning, and so just gives that kind of like boost, that creativity boost. And I feel like a lot of folks have walked away from this exercise with ideas like, oh, I'm actually gonna use that.
Yes, yeah. And I know I say this every time, but I think it's if you're facilitating this back at your home school, I think this is a pretty handy phrase to keep in your back pocket. After people do this exercise and they share, these little mini successes, I think it's important to say, okay, now imagine how much better your plans would be if it wasn't governed by random dice rolls, but by intentional choices that you actually make in your curriculum. So, if they can do such good work with random connections, imagine how good it would be when it's really informed.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. I think I'll stop sharing my screen at this point and open it up for final thoughts.
Kim, thank you so much for that. I I just see so much potential to like bring in student engagement with this type of work, and just the intrinsic motivation that could be developed when this happens in a classroom. I wonder, like, my question to you is, what do you see as barriers for teachers to be able to implement more deeper learning in their classrooms?
Well, I think sometimes we get stuck on a couple of different things. One is sometimes we get stuck on just like we have to master the basics, and it's true. There's some things that have to be quote unquote mastered, but I think it's a mistake, and I think Meta and Fine would say the same thing. I think it's a mistake to constantly put off the deep learning because you have to get all the foundation perfectly in place. You could do some foundational work, of course, in any given class, but then move your class to in some way where they're doing some deeper learning, despite the fact that they're not necessarily experts in whatever or don't have all the foundations. Like I think it's a mistake to assume that this learning is always like perfect building blocks that just keep adding up. Like I think you can have some gaps in your background and still do deep learning, right? I think you could be experiencing more challenging and interesting kinds of questions, even if you're missing some basic pieces,
Yeah,
So,
I can see that. Yeah,
yeah,
I could see that feeling like a little scary for teachers, right? Like to jump in and sort of take a risk like that, worrying that they might be missing some of the foundational pieces there. And then but it sounds like your advice to them is like still go for it. Like give it put that in place, and you'll see how some of those pieces will start to fill in just through the work that students are doing. Sounds like.
yeah, yeah. I think that the trap is you spend all year doing the basics or whatever you think is foundational, and you never get to the deep learning part.
Right.
So it's almost like the deep learning part is, as you pointed out to us, Tim, like can be ingrained in some of the smaller formatives and not separated from foundational skills or content or the standards, right? Like it's anchored in the same material that we might go about something in a conventional way, but I think what I hear you saying is sort of like make the make the connection, help your students make that connection and think for themselves, versus stopping at the content delivery space, which I think, as teachers, we're like, oh, I've got to cover this curriculum, or I have to cover this program, or I have to cover this content, but rather like being mindful of like, how are students meeting transferable skills, portrait of a graduate competencies in this and in the everyday, not just in these big projects that I've planned for, but how are they learning for transfer when they're learning grammar, usage, and mechanics? Like, you can make it there too, right? You can say, well, that's how we communicate. And that's actually how if I put a comma in a different place, like, it's going to change my message. And so there's these small and large ways to incorporate it, but it really isn't, divergent from the actual like content that students are responsible
for. I started earlier in another conversation, we were talking about some conversations that we had with colleagues, and I had this really fascinating conversation on Friday of this past week. I was talking to a teacher a math teacher who was trying to help her students get ready for AP exams by sharing AP like assessments, 50% of which are multiple choice questions, right? So there's this multiple choice piece where whatever thinking the students have is completely hidden by the fact that there's a circled B, right? All right, I don't know how you got there, but you got to B, right? And there's no way to see the thinking. And we were talking about that, and with a little bit of a gentle push, I was like, I'm not sure how you can like modify a multiple choice question, but it may be worth asking the question, how can you take multiple choice questions and somehow, understand student thinking? And within moments, she said, much to her credit, she was like, oh, I could give them a problem with 5 choices, and I could have them explain why the 4 wrong ones are wrong. Like, what is it about these 4 questions? Like, for each one that I can identify is wrong and can say why, I can get a point. And if you're thinking like AP scoring, 1 through 5, right? There's an interesting natural fit there. And she, within a few moments, she was like, oh, I could totally do that and really see their thinking. And then you could even say, well, if they could show me the problem done out, really completely that led to a distinct answer, then of course the rationale for the other 4 would be, well, I did the problem, according to the known mathematics, and like, this is not the answer I got, or whatever. There's at least, you could at least see the work, right? And very quickly she came to the place where she was like, oh, I'd have to ask fewer questions, but I'd see a lot more of their thinking. And right there, she was sold. She's like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Why not see the thinking in fewer cases than just having, I don't know, 30 examples of non-thinking where you can't see the thinking.
Absolutely.
Anyway.
Yeah. So, okay. We've probably come pretty close to the end of our time here, but I'm thinking, Tim, you mentioned a couple of great resources. Do you want to remind us of some, or let us know some ones that you didn't get to mention, whether it be books, websites, things like that, to really jump in. If you want to jump into deeper learning, or you want to expand your knowledge around it, what should we be reading, Tim, or listening
to? The 2 books that I showed earlier are both well worth reading. The Meta and Fine book is really fascinating, and I would recommend it to anybody who's interested in this. And they go into more detail about the idea of mastery, identity, and creativity in ways that I didn't hear. And I would also say, going back to that Susan Brookhart book about assessing higher order thinking skills, she creates these very simple little rubrics for identifying higher order thinking skills, which I think is just another way of talking about deep learning in some ways. And it's a slim volume, and it's worth picking up and looking at. I think we're also going to be providing a whole set of resources. Meta and Fine have been interviewed dozens of times, and those interviews are available on YouTube in a variety of ways. And I know I've assembled 5-minute interviews and 50-minute interviews and so forth. So there'll be a large collection of videos to kind of like tap into if people are interested in pursuing this.
That's great. Thanks, Tim.
Yeah, thank you.
And they also, folks should listen to you too, right? If they want to learn more. So hopefully folks will listen to this podcast and complete the exit ticket for 2 hours of professional development. And in the Padlet, you'll be able to access the audio version of any of these and the exit ticket and any of the resources that we talked about here. So I think that's it for us right now. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.